Hello again, everybody. This is James Bartley, and you're watching and listening to the Cosmic Switchboard Show. Today I have an old friend, Evie Lorgan, and if everything works out, we'll have David Eckhart join us in a little bit. This will be a continuing series, a semi-regular program where we're going to be talking about the reptilian issues, and there's some other researchers and therapists that we'll be having on in the future to talk about the reptilians from their standpoint. Because the way Evie and I see it, I think I could speak for her in this regard, that this is where rubber meets the road kind of stuff. This is bottom line kind of stuff. So much disinformation, so much misdirection. Uh, what we're doing is getting this information out to people pretty much like us. This is not really meant for a general audience, people just mired in the surface level, right? This is information for people that have an understanding that there is a reptilian overlordship, that this has been going on for a long time, and we may not have reached the end game, but maybe the final curtain isn't rising yet, but this is like the act before the final curtain, the final act. So we need to get into the right mindset and recognize what it is that's going on and who our foes are, quite frankly. So without any further ado, Evie Lorgan, welcome back.
Well, thank you for having me, James. And we'll just make it an impromptu conversation about what we talked about and how it connects with the reptilians and our understanding of the factors that kind of move into this in not only what we discovered early on with the alien abduction, MK Ultra, satanic ritual abuse, but how it's playing out psychologically and how it manifests hyperdimensionally and what's going on in the world and these forces that seem to be the same forces working underneath all the time. But I think there's a lot of misunderstanding as the causes and conditions, and people are not seeing, quote, the forest for the trees, getting caught up in the distractions, which is actually part of the game. So if we can understand this for how it works, maybe we can get out of this with less damage, because there's a lot going on in the world. And you know as well as I do, the things that are going on are it's just intensifying.
Well, we're seeing this massive collective trauma meted out again to the populace. I mean, 9/11 was a scant, what, 20 years ago now, a little over 20 years. And boy, how much has changed since then. And then this whole COVID business has come up, and the emotional heartstrings and the psychological games they're playing on people. Oh, we're going to ease the restrictions. Oh, we've just had another spike, of course, because they keep giving these bogus tests. We've had another spike, so we're going to have to push back on easing the restrictions, and it's a yo-yo going up and down, up and down. Meanwhile, depression is going on at a great level. Suicides, domestic violence, substance abuse going through the roof. It's a huge loosh fest. And who is this benefiting? And I'd like your thoughts on that, because there's this notion to this day, Evie, that this is just power mad bankers. This is just corrupt humans. Never mind that the corrupt humans, seemingly humans, but we know they're really reptilian hybrid plantation managers. That yes, a lot of these surface level truthers will acknowledge, yes, they get involved in all these pagan, Luciferian, satanic rites, but the coin doesn't drop. It doesn't occur to them that there's something not quite human about these practitioners, that they're not like us, right?
No.
That they themselves are hybrids, the demigods that were spoken of long ago. So I just, at the outset, I'd like your thoughts on that, because what they've seemed to have done is you look at the human race, think of it as like collectively as a child, and then you just constantly traumatize the child over and over and over, split it off, imbue all these alters into it, pervert it every other way, and that's the human race today. We can just see the difference in uh, the people around us, just how far off the mark they are as far as an understanding of what's going on. So please give us your thoughts of what brought us up to this stage, and how this Luciferian, Babylonian, reptilian agenda is playing out before our eyes.
Well, I would say it's playing out, and there is some awareness in a larger scale happening now in the in the world with what we call the QAnon movement, which is real big in the US, but also in the world, which are like coded messages for behind the scenes of, the draining the swamp, right, of what's going on in the world happening through primarily the QAnon and the military and Trump and that particular alleged agenda of, clearing the swamp of the pedophiles and the trafficking, which is really run by the, I would call it the Illuminati, the more of the satanic bloodline people who are hosted by non-human malevolent entities which feed on the blood sacrifice and the sexual torture, as well as many other perverse and disgusting things to get the loosh energy and power to carry out their agenda. So that's part of it. And I think part of that is actually true. But my concern is that there could be another level of deception even beyond that storyline, or taking advantage of people believing in that so much, but then not understanding there might be another coup behind it. And maybe it's because I'm a researcher who's researched so many conspiracies and see how they can use, for example, I'm not saying Q is false light, but how false light has manifested even the UFO visitation and the ET contact phenomena in particular has done a lot of false light types of screen memories and virtual reality scenarios, or even they create these things in order to carry out a larger frame agenda that will promote their long-term goals. So, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question here, but I guess I would say that there's definitely what we call a non-human element that will act in and through alleged humans and human bloodlines and people who are weakened or mind controlled, or I think it's a type of corruption that happens on a not only a physical level, but a psychological and a spiritual level, where they get basically taken over by these non-human, like reptilians or dracos, or maybe some kinds of demons. We really don't know exactly unless we perceive it clairvoyantly, and it happens differently with different people. So, and that compels them to basically carry out was really the old Babylonian traditions of ritual blood sacrifice and even sexual sacrifice and sexual rituals, which is part of the corrupted ways of getting spiritual power, really. So this happened early on in humanity's origin. I think some of the fallen angel narratives might be what's behind it, but we may not know fully. Well, how did they really corrupt the human race? Or there was like a serpent seed, for example, of the fallen angelics, whose, whether the human with the hybrids born had corrupted genetics such that the real human soul couldn't come through and imbue it with a kind of conscientious based soul matrix and brain functioning. And that I'm sensing that, maybe there's actually a type of corrupted genetics that makes them have a brain damage that will type of manifest like psychopathic narcissistic personality disorder tendencies, where there actually is a brain anomaly that functions differently. Like people know in brain scans, for example, of psychopaths in particular, like serial killers, that their brain scans are different and they do function differently in the brain. And I think it's the hijacking or the the amygdala doesn't work right. And then we've heard people talk about this who've been involved in mind control projects. And I know maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but the point I want to make is I believe there is a physical DNA and soul matrix corruption that is propelling behaviors and consciousness, which is harmful to humanity and life through human sacrifice, blood sacrifice, sexual torture, and basically narcissistic abuse and control, right? So that's what's running their behaviors, either by the spiritual entities or a combination of those malevolent entities in a corrupted genetic vehicle or vessel that has the brain damage that basically precludes empathy or impulse control with a lower frontal lobe capacity, as well as maybe the amygdala's messed up and the rapacity, as well as maybe the amygdala's messed up and the reptilian brain has really taken over. So people like Max Spears, I believe it was Max Spears who really brought a lot of this information out on the sexual torture and trauma-based mind control in his particular project, I don't know if it was the Phoenix Project, Montauk Project. There was many of the projects or that basically are MK Ultra trauma based. But what he basically stated was that when a child is sodomized at an early age, between 0 and 6 years old, it forces the Kundalini energy to shoot through the body in an unnatural way that blasts open the third eye. And it also could scar the brain stems so that they have certain kinds of abilities, not only psychic third eye perception, but overwhelming psychic perception, but sometimes a photographic memory, but other kinds of behaviors and compartmentalization of consciousness, which allows an easier programming through multiple personality disorder. So basically, you know, these bloodlines, and he talked about this for years, right? And he was murdered probably, or who knows if his death was faked, I don't know, but I think because of what he spoke out, that he basically told the truth in some of the darker areas that we've been aware of over time through the reptilian involvement that kept repeating itself. People reporting, you know, they're seeing these lizard-like entities overshadowed or taking over someone's body in a temporary possession during sexual activity, during like one of these love bite kind of things, like a incubi, succubi, but it's more dramatic in terms of the reptilian appearance and oppression of the person. So that definitely has been more of a report that happened over time, to not be just, you know, something that somebody's making up. I think there's something to this whole reptilian thing, which is what we're really talking about, right? So I'll just kind of stop for here and let you go back to where you want to direct the conversation.
Before we came on to do this discussion, Evie, we talked about the Mary Henry case, one of the classic cases that Barbie Bartholomew shared with us. She shared her contact notes with us, her insight and her information gleaned with working with Mary Henry for some years. And that case, to me, it encapsulates in so many ways, from a collective general standpoint, what's going on. Because people can see the constant gaslighting of the corporate media, constantly being lied, essentially being psychologically abused over and over and over, along with all these other institutions of control, the medical, pharmaceutical industry, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what we saw in the Mary Henry case, going from general to the specific, back to the general again, is we saw a level of deception with the Mary Henry case, which is a classic. If one were to like gain the kind of understanding that exists within the case, for example, it was an example where she thought that she was in contact with benevolent beings, that she allowed these benevolent beings, what she perceived to be benevolent beings, to begin to communicate with her. And then this manifested in automatic writing. They began giving her all these prophecies, kind of the rapture scenario, which we discussed. And then ultimately she began having intercourse with one of the beings that she was in contact with. And this being took on the appearance of Jerry Reed, a well-known, at the time, country and western singer. And
Yeah.
I think the guy appeared in TV shows and movies too.
Yeah, it was an old country guitar singer named Jim Reeves.
Jimmy Reed, I'm sorry.
Reeves, yeah.
Yeah. And then it just went on from there. Things degenerated. It took a very dark black magic turn. So give us your thoughts on that, because it has to do with a lot of the stuff we're talking about, the Babylonian, reptilian, dark magic, dark Cupid aspects.
It's amazing how, in some respects, I think Barbara Bartholomew had a genius case that demonstrated all these elements that tied together in a way that was undeniable, of the connections between the malevolent aspect of the false light, ET involved in abductions and channeling and prophecies, and even to the point of, you know, rapture, and then being involved in, let's say, the sexual connection between this spirit guide who claimed to be this dead guitar player named Jim Reeves, but it started out as ET based writings, automatic writing of, you're being chosen as a, to be a voice for this ETs and what's going to happen in the future. And you have a very important role. And it's classic ET contactee types of messages. But this deteriorated into a, basically an incubi, succubi, demonic sexual connection. It was probably a reptilian. I think she discovered that the reptilian was masquerading as this, guitar player who was one of her favorites. That I think one of the things about it was that he had a certain love song that was played over and over in her mind and in her memory that triggered her broken heart. And this goes back to how reptilians will go back into the memory of someone to trigger a traumatic memory, to extract loosh, or to gain entry into their wounds, which seems to allow them entry. So that actually was the entry point where she was heard this song, and then it brought back all these memories, and then she felt love and advances by this being that were actually pleasant, right? Pleasant sexual, Kundalini rising kinds of stuff with psychic abilities, and her arthritis was healed in her hand. So there was this benevolent aspect of this being, making love to her that was phenomenal, connected to these ET guides, So, but it did deteriorate into basically a form of demonic oppression and eventual possession, or almost near possession, where she had to get exercised and helped. And I'm just amazed that, these kinds of things are overlooked, where people are not able to see what I call the forest for the trees, to see the connections between things and how they operate in a larger scale, so that people kind of get caught up in the minutia of, oh, well, that's not that, that's this. And, I'm special. And people get caught up in this specialness of, these ET contacts. And it was just classic deception on multiple levels that I think that was overlooked by most researchers. And, and her vulnerabilities, I think, were chosen in a classic love bite. But in her case, the love bite was with this spirit guide who was really a reptilian, right? But she later actually did have love bites that were set up with real human beings afterwards. So this continued on, actually, even after the case, even that I didn't write about. So it just goes to tell you that, she led on and allowed this into her life because she was lonely and she was traumatized, and she was, a mom of like 8 kids, and her husband was gone, and it wasn't a good marriage. And then she had classic abductions happen earlier in her life that was recalled through hypnosis. But it wasn't until Barbie worked with her that she got the screen memories, got underneath some of the screen memories, to find out what really happened and what was the nature of these beings. So it just goes to tell you that there's so much more involved. But the reptilian was definitely the one behind the, pretending to be this, dead singer lover. And then it escalated into a near demonic possession with all kinds of really bizarre things. It's in my book, actually, The Dark Side of Cupid, called Mariah and the Spirit Guide is the name of the chapter. And I couldn't recount the whole thing, but I know that you know about this case because we spoke about it with Barbara Bartlett years ago.
Yeah, and there was a couple of aspects to it which, bear repeating it, and it shows the fact that some aspects of the ET interdimensional, hyperdimensional malign influence is directly connected to the Luciferian black magic aspect, because
Yeah.
after she had gotten into the automatic writing, essentially allowing this entity to work through her and essentially take over her for a while,
Yeah.
then she began having these intrusive thoughts, these
Mhm.
obsessive compulsive disorder thoughts.
Yeah.
After she had gotten into the automatic writing, essentially allowing this entity to work through her and essentially take over her for a while,
Yeah.
then she began having these intrusive thoughts, these
Mhm.
obsessive compulsive disorder thoughts that were uh, quite disturbing, such as
Yeah.
pour scalding hot coffee on her children. Okay,
Yeah.
these were the
Directed
thoughts she
that.
kept getting. She'd have a pot of coffee in her hand, and there's a little kid, and it's like, pour the coffee on the kid, you know.
It was like an opening of the invasiveness of not just one entity that was coming through in the automatic writing, and then these sexual liaisons that happened with this Jim Reeves slash, shape-shifting reptilian, but it seemed to escalate into more and more entities of a certain type. And what was interesting is that in her original abduction, when she recalled an abduction where she was on her way to work, and there was, I think at least an hour and a half of missing time, at least, if not more. And then some of the entities had these black caps on that had a widow's peak type of hairline, and they were tall Nordic types that she saw, but I think she saw 4 fingers instead of 5. It was just kind of weird. I'm trying to remember where I'm going with this now. I lost my train of thought, but the entities involved were the same that came through. Like, for example, as the basically reptilian and demonic forces became more invasive, she started hearing more voices, not just the one who was part of the spirit guide messages that came through that was supposedly, a group of ETs, basically, or one main ET, but there was actually a group of them. So what happened is that when she had these sexual liaisons with this entity, it would be, she went into this dissociative state, looked outside her body, and then she could see herself as another woman who was one of these, widow's peak dark haired women who was dressed like a witch, like and then being made love to by the reptilian entity. So it escalated into something that appeared like a witch's Sabbath ritual, where she was on an altar having sex with this entity while there was like witches going around and a counterclockwise thing, doing this chanting. So, a simple thing escalated into basically near demonic possession, and more entities that were involved with a kind of ritualistic manifestation that she was able to observe out of body with what was happening on another dimensional level while they were feeding on her sexual energy. So, and the whole widow's peak thing and how they appeared like classic vampire beings, like, what was that, Addams Family? Remember when they had like the widow's peak hairline and the dark hair? Well, that was how they appeared in her, how she saw these entities who were involved with the ritual aspect. So it just kind of escalated into more and more of the invasiveness of not just one entity, but it was a group of ETs. Then pretty soon it was like a group of like demonic friggin' beings who were doing these weird rituals. So it begs the
it
question.
opened the door big
Yeah,
time.
it
It
opened
allowed.
the door. And but still, I mean, even with the classic story, and it was basically, the Earth's going to go through all these changes, which it is, volcanoes and tidal waves and earthquakes, and people being raptured and saved by ETs, and then nothing happened, right? She ended up dying, right? So nothing ever happened in her life, but they're giving her the storyline and the special job of being, a mouthpiece for these benevolent ETs are going to come save us during the rapture, and that never happened. So it begs the question of even these belief systems that people are still holding. I mean, I'm very skeptical about rapture narratives, that it's dangerous. It's dangerous. Yeah.
Well, we talked before we began recording here about Arthur C. Clarke, the well-known science fiction writer, who was a known CIA asset. He was a pedophile, and his first novel was Childhood's End. And I watched a documentary about this, and they drew some full color illustrations depicting what the story was about. So they had these storyboards, cartoon kind of, but not cartoonish, but very good illustrations of what the story was about. And in general, the story was about these benevolent beings, very much of a V
Oh,
scenario. If people remember the original V series and then the remake, right?
yeah.
Where these benevolent beings showed up and they had all these signs and wonders and wanted to uplift humanity. And then, even in the uh, illustrations in this documentary, it turned out that these benevolent beings, they depicted them as Dracos, as winged reptilian beings. And in the end, the final, storyboard panel illustration shows all these humans, particularly children, being levitated up into the sky, presumably into a big ship,
Oh,
right?
wow.
And this ties into Barbie Bartholik's, what she called the cattle car scenario, where many people that she'd worked with had either consciously or in regression were told and shown by beings, by reptilians also, of this potential future scenario outcome
Mhm.
where these large craft would land, all these zombied out, passive humans, docile humans, under some form of mind control, would be led onto the craft
Oh,
and then taken away. And it was a like that old Twilight Zone episode,
yeah.
to serve man scenario. They were being taken away for consumption elsewhere, right?
Wow.
And we know those things already happen underground,
Yes.
the processing
Yeah.
plants, and we know that a lot of humans are being taken off world as part of this cosmic trafficking program. It's not just
Yes.
trafficking on Earth;
Mhm.
they're being, you know, uh, trafficked elsewhere. And one of our colleagues, a dear friend of ours, who's since passed away, so I think we can talk about
Yeah.
her findings and her information, Colleen Johnston,
Oh, yeah.
which was a fascinating, and there were dark, troubling aspects
Yeah.
to her information too, because uh, I still won't say the name of the cult leader that she, at a karmic level, had infiltrated, because her followers may still be around,
Yeah.
even though this cult leader has since carked it, i.e., died, right?
Yeah.
But long story short, Colleen Johnston was the trans medium, the channeler for this particular group. And let's say the name of this cult leader. Well, we'll call her Cindy. My apologies to all the Cindys out there. Okay. And
Yeah.
and then there
Mm.
was an outer circle, and the inner circle of Cindy's. They got the real scoop. They got the real information. The people on the outside, and of course, and it's just an initiatory thing, depending on their level of trustworthiness, how far along they move in their studies and their disciplines and their initiations, would determine if they're ever let into the inner circle. So the people on the outer circle were not given the real information. They were just fed pablum. The people in the inner circle had a good idea what was going on. And essentially what was going on, folks, was Colleen Johnston was a trans medium. She would allow these Draco to possess her,
Yeah.
and they would then give forth all this information to Cindy. Cindy the cult leader, and this was undiluted.
Yeah.
You talk about Q drops; these were like Draco drops.
Yes. I
Uh,
mean,
uh,
hardcore. Yeah.
yeah, and it was not sugar coated with this highfalutin new age lottie dot stuff. It was like, you will do this, you will do
I believe.
this. This is what's going on. This is what's going on, right?
Yeah.
And Colleen would not be consciously aware of any of this because she'd been taken over.
Yeah.
Now, the recordings were made, transcriptions were made, and then she would look back and read all the stuff that had come out and listen to the recordings, and her mind would be blown because these Dracos would be talking about world domination, control, and enslavement of humanity. And they were working through the Cindy woman, right? Who actually got in comms with me at a certain point and tried to, buddy up with me.
Yeah.
And on one occasion, because very, very cult like, Colleen was living in like a compound, living in this commune
Mm-hmm.
with this cult.
Mm.
And she heard a sound late at night. So Colleen opens the door, looks out into the corridor, and there's Cindy being led down the corridor by these Draco, right? So
Mm.
it's not just that they were coming through in these transmissions to Colleen, and Colleen was turning around and giving this information to the inner circle of the cult. She'd eyeballed, Colleen had the actual Draco in physical manifestation leading Cindy out to do something with her. Cindy seemed to be in this very docile, kind of transfigurated state, right? Mind controlled state. So it's another example where even within the cult itself, the ones in the outer circle, they were just given pablum. They were just
Yeah.
given this metaphysical bunkum to kind of confuse, mislead them. And in the inner circle, they were told directly by the Draco, and these Draco on occasion would manifest, like in that case I just described, and they would tell them what's going on, what's really going on. And this also dovetails with when Barbie Bartholic had infiltrated that cult in Washington State, where
Yes.
there was an underground processing plant. Many of these people in the cult on the surface were part of this cult where they basically give up all their worldly possessions and they come under the malign influence of this woman, a
Mm-hmm.
blonde haired woman who was a channeler, et cetera, well known. I'm not going to say her name. On one occasion, they did, the channeler lady did this exercise where she made everyone wear a mask over their eyes, right? And she would the channeler would walk up and down the aisles of this lecture hall. And Barbie, being Barbie, kind of tilted her head back and looked beneath the blindfold to see what
Yeah.
was going on. She saw this channeler woman and her eyes were like red and she was like
Ooh.
full on like monster mode, right? And Barbie goes, ooh, and then, you know, makes
Wow.
like she's just blindfolded like all the rest. But see, that's an example that you were just pointing out that what seems to be this new age spiritual essentially harmless
Yeah.
for set of teachings, there's a dark undercurrent into it, which and I look around now. We just did that panel not too long ago about the divine goddess,
Oh,
the
yes.
divine
Right.
feminine, and
Feminine, masculine, yeah.
yeah, and all the hate that was meted out, particularly to Laura Matsu and to Kelsey, right?
Yeah.
And they both bared their souls. They talked about, Kelsey talked about how she felt the power, and
Oh,
I hope
yeah.
I'm not uh, misquoting her, but she felt the power of this Draco energy coming through
Oh,
her
yeah.
to
And it
the
is real.
point, yeah,
Yeah.
to the point where she could have made, and she did make for a time, these males eat out of the palm of her hand, basically. She
Yeah.
had that power working through her.
Yes.
And she could have taken the path of least resistance and just keep doing that, keep making money, keep manipulating all these males. But she fought
Mm,
against it. She fought
yeah.
against it. She worked against it, healed, and now she's sharing her story, and she gets hammered anyway because it shatters that illusion that so
Oh,
many
yeah.
women out there of, oh, I'm a embodiment of the divine feminine. And then just really quickly,
Yeah.
because I want to hear your take on this. See, women can get away with that. Women can say, oh, I'm a embodiment of the divine feminine. A guy can't get away with that. I mean, we'll
Yeah.
get bricks thrown at us. Look what happened to David Icke. Oh, I'm the son of God. And, for decades thereafter, people would point at him and laugh on the street, right?
Yeah.
But women, for whatever reason, have a free pass when they say, I'm a divine goddess manifested, incarnated on earth, right? So when Laura and Kelsey and others come along to point out, wait, there's some pitfalls to that whole concept. There's some dark aspects to that, where
Yeah.
the wrong kind of energies, the wrong kind of intelligences start working through you. You start to develop all this temporal power.
Oh, yeah.
Men start eating out of the palm of your hand,
Oh,
but you're
so
being
powerful.
manipulated and used for a darker, greater agenda. So, I
Yeah.
just decided to throw all that out there, from Colleen Johnston, from, the panel that we did, and just would like your thoughts on that, Evie.
Well, I'm glad you reiterated Colleen's case because I actually had forgotten about a lot of the things that you shared. But I do remember where one of the women in the cult, that was her friend, who Colleen actually got out of it when she realized it was dark. But then she had a friend who was struggling to get out, who had to go through an exorcism where she got taken over by an entity, and then she had to basically help this woman for many hours, you know, for like 48 hours or whatever it was, during a complete demonic possession and a depossession that took place, which, suggests that, sometimes the channeling could lead to that depending on what's working, what windows they open. But the other thing that I'm sure it's kind of a no-brainer, but with the outer circle of the channeling and what Colleen was also involved in earlier, and which really she was the kind of person who just wanted to help other people and heal, and she had a natural psychic ability, and I guess it was the healing ability, and I don't know if it started with Reiki or whatever it was, but they actually did do genuine healings through these benevolent light beings that they believed were benevolent light beings, and they did do genuine healings, right? Which is the, what you would call it, the, there's a word in intelligence circles, but basically how to give them the positive, enough of the positive behaviors to pull them in the false construct of being, pulled in with the dark side. So they always have to give you a little bit of fodder of the good stuff to pull you in, which is genuinely just healing. But then on the other side of it is on the inner circle, well, this is really a operation of control and destruction on a higher level, of these higher beings that are completely taking advantage of people who had no idea. I'm trying to remember, there was another thing you brought up. What was the other question, or the other?
Well, I brought up the cult that Barbie had infiltrated in Washington State. Uh, it was run by a shapeshifter woman, reptilian. Uh, there happened to be a large reptilian processing plant underground nearby where some of the members of the cult on the surface had been taken underground to
Oh,
this reptilian processing plant and seen the bodies going down the conveyor belts and seen the bodies being dismembered and what have you, which again, folks,
yeah,
this is rubber meets the road stuff. One
yeah.
thing about the Q drops is it still keeps things at a surface, even though they talk about underground bases and children being rescued, et cetera, something that we all want to happen, right? It's nowhere does it go anywhere near the non-human reptilian aspects. It's still just humans that are
Because I
ultimately
still
behind all
feel,
this.
I heard this on another interview. I don't mean to interrupt. And it was somebody who was heavily involved in the behind the scenes rescuing and knowing about, who they're rescuing, what they do, what they see, but they did not really talk about the reptilian element. And they seem to think, well, it's just humans doing this to humans, but you have to understand there is this malevolent aspect of other human involvement that they tend to poo-poo and act as if it doesn't exist. They still kind of have this black and white thinking, just like we met in the old days. Remember in the old days when people would be coming out about their MK Ultra experiences, and maybe in the SRA bloodlines or the satanic ritual abuse types of Illuminati bloodline family members who are put through trauma-based mind control. And some of them would come out to talk about that, but then they would just completely poo-poo the alien stuff and the reptilian stuff and say, well, it's either all demonic or it's all human and it's all mind control. And they'd still have this black and white thinking, which is actually part of the problem of what I call the manifestations of trauma itself. Want to see things in black and white terms. So I think it's not just a black and white thing, that there's much more complexity involved with the reptilians. But one of the things I wanted to say was that I did have one of these my lab dream experiences, and I had shared this with you years ago, of being shown a processing plant of sorts, and whether or not this was a real, physical event, or I'm just being shown this in kind of remote viewing images. But I remember seeing that, like, the classic conveyor belt with body parts on it. And another experience where being taken underground, where humans are working in conjunction with aliens, with certain reptilians, and I don't know if you've heard this from others, but seeing particular type of reptilian underground that would be kept in these special rooms that were like windows, but they were enclosed in a type of UV light for some reason. And then when they fed these are reptilians that looked black, and they had like more of a horn kind of thing. And it was a different type of reptilian, but it would be in these UV type of enclosed glass wall cages. And then when they would feed them, they had these drop open lids that come from the ceiling, and they're able to move them, so they opened up, and then these cages would come out, and then inside the cages was like prepubescent blonde naked children that they would basically consume. And that there were humans working down there basically in charge of helping to basically feed these beings. And why they were keeping these reptilians down there and feeding them is anybody's guess why they're doing that. But I've heard other reports years ago, and this was, remember when I interviewed Andy Perro, who was the Montauk boy, and this was before they even called the secret space program and all that super soldier stuff. But he remembered seeing underground bases, women and children in cages screaming for help, and also the presence of reptilians doing, consumption of infant children, like terrible, cannibalism, acts of cannibalism, and as well as other things. Interviewed Andy Perro, who was the Montauk boy, and this was before they even called the secret space program and all that super soldier stuff. But he remembered seeing underground bases, women and children in cages screaming for help, and also the presence of reptilians doing, consumption of infant children, like terrible, cannibalism, acts of cannibalism, and as well as other things. So this was reported back in 1998 in some of my earlier interviews, but then nobody really wanted to believe. They thought it was crazy. And that kind of came out with some of Arizona Wilder's original testimony with David Icke and some of those things. But even now, it's like it's taken this long for people to finally, oh, these things are happening, and they can only think, oh, well, maybe it's just human trafficking and it's just sex trafficking, and well, maybe there's some cannibalism, but they still don't get the degree of the involvement and the degree of corruption, and that has been kept, under the basically hidden from everyone. It's just, yeah.
Well, they don't understand also the nature of the initiatory rites for these fraternal orders, for and also the female equivalent in these dark priestess orders.
Yeah.
That, first of all, like you pointed out, they're largely from these hybridized bloodlines. Secondly, there's the incarnational karmic aspect where the same familiar entities, familiar spirits track these family bloodlines, track these individual, as Ed Casey would have said, soul entities, these particular souls. They seem to know when they're going to reincarnate into what families, and the same entities that worked and manipulated through them in previous incarnations are there again, because they
Yeah.
exist in a timeless realm, and they're not constrained by time factors like we are, right?
Yeah.
So they don't understand that as they progress up the initiatory ladder and they're expected to do more and more sordid things
Yeah.
and conduct ceremonies in vortex ridden places that are designed to take place in vortex portal areas.
Yeah. Right.
So
Open
they
portals.
get taken up, and pretty soon because the entities, the souls that they were sharing to begin with were these non-human entities, reptilians and other entities to begin with, like a Hillary Clinton type, would have been corrupted from birth. I mean, she would have been born, conceived, all that on specific days, specific times,
Yeah. Moonchild rituals.
moonchild stuff, astronomical alignments, all that stuff plays a role. And so when when they come around again, right, then they're automatically brought into the fold, put through all the initiations. And so as time goes on, more of what was in there initially, that non-human aspect, comes out more and more and more and more. And pretty soon they're just completely taken over. It's not even really a takeover. It was like, this is what it was meant to be anyway.
Yeah.
They were just this host vessel. It was understood at a higher level that they would be taken up by a particular entity or entities. And so that's what's missing from a lot of these surface level types, where they recognize that, okay, there are these evil humans, but they don't realize that they're not
Right.
even quite human.
Yeah. And
And
like they have a soul. Like I always question whether when they talk about the fallen angels who had basically mated with humans to create the Nephilim, which were the original hybrid serpent race of sorts, maybe. And I don't know if I know this correctly, but they would have to have the souls of one of their parents. So some of them might have had souls and some of them didn't. Or I think the genetics could have been corrupted in the downline in some of them and not some of them, right? So that the corrupted genetics made them become basically cannibals, right? They had become blood drinking, flesh eating cannibals of like psychopathology, right? So there's some kind of corrupted element within these hybrid lines of the fallen ones, although not all of them in the families are like that at all. Some of them are like wonderful people who get out and they tell the truth and they're just blessed by the Spirit of God and they come and tell the truth. But there's something really creepy about it in terms of the hosting and the possessing. And I think that one of the things somebody had told me in an interview, it was the Scandinavian Maya Lab, and I mentioned this before, but her sense of genetics was that she knew she had augmented genetics from being genetically modified as one of these MyLabs in an abduction um, program. But she was in the Draco program, so she had part Draco or believed herself to be a Draco in another life, but it was actually the Draco that was hosting. I don't know if her bloodline, something they stay embedded in bloodlines or they come in like, I don't know, viruses that aren't activated until a certain time. And so if you accept the consciousness of the being, let's say you accept the possession of the entity through a ritual or whatever, And then once that's activated in your consciousness, then it expresses the hybrid genetics more fully in the body. And otherwise, it would be like in remission if you don't express the consciousness or accept it or have it fully be activated in you.
It's like
And
the
then,
energetic frequency and
yeah,
the intent behind it activates the
yeah.
DNA.
And so that might make them, let's say, if they fully accepted the entity, then it activates a type of augmented or hybridized genetics, which would maybe make them have the appearance of full-on shape shifting in a physical way. So some of them, I think, do have full-on shape-shifting capabilities. And I've heard that by some SRA survivors, that one of their altered personalities is actually a shape-shifting reptilian.
Oh yes, and the notion of shapeshifting long predated David Icke's information, long predated a lot of, we've known about it for a long time.
Yeah.
And it's not just that people shapeshift into reptilians, they can shapeshift into other beings as well. And in the ET scheme of things, a little broader cosmic perspective, shapeshifting amongst ET races is fairly common. Well, we've reached the end of a fascinating and
Okay.
thought-provoking discussion with our guest, Evie Lorgan. Uh, Evie, please give your website information to our listeners and viewers.
Okay, well, my website is evelorgan.com or alienlovebite.com. And I have all kinds of articles, and you can also get both my books directly through my website or through me. And there's a contact form for you to contact me, because one of my books will no longer be available after the end of the year. The Dark Side of Cupid will only be available through me in a hard copy until I get things squared away with Amazon. So get it while you can, basically, because it might go offline. So yeah. And then I have a new article on my website too about disguised grief and emotional blocks to disguised grief and how to go through that healing process. So yeah.
And to our dear listeners out there, if you like what we do, if you believe in what we do, please go to the CosmicSwitchboard.com, sign up and become a member, and we'll see you at the top of the next segment.